I didn't even recognize my own land when I pulled into the driveway. The dirt path I knew so well was gone, replaced, paved over. There were tire tracks where corn once grew. A massive metal fence blocked the entrance, and behind it stood something I never expected to see. Steel beams, scaffolding, construction workers shouting over the hum of machines. I sat there, engine running, staring at what looked like the skeleton of a hotel. On my land, my farmland. I hadn't been gone long, just 6 weeks. I took some time off to visit my sister out of state. Left the place in good shape. My tractor parked, tools locked up, gates sealed with a chain. There were no plans, no requests, no calls. Nothing. But in those 6 weeks, the world shifted. It looked like an entire construction site had risen from the dirt. The sign out front said, Future Site, Willow Vista Lodge, for HOA members and guests. I nearly laughed. HOA members? Guests? I didn't live in a subdivision. This was my family's farmland, passed down for 3 generations. My grandfather plowed this soil with his bare hands. Now, someone thought it made a perfect spot for their luxury lodge. I stepped out of my truck and walked toward the temporary gate. A guy in a neon vest waved at me like I was trespassing. He asked if I was with delivery. I said no, I own the land. His face changed instantly. He didn't know what to say. He radioed someone. A woman in heels and a hard hat walked over, clipboard in hand, trying to look professional. She introduced herself as the HOA construction coordinator. That was the first time I even heard the word HOA mentioned in months. See, I lived just outside a rapidly growing subdivision. I sold a small strip of land to the HOA years ago so they could build an access road. But the rest, over 40 acres, was still mine. I never signed away development rights. No one contacted me. Not once. So I asked her point blank, "Who gave you permission to build on this land?" She looked at her clipboard, shuffled some papers, and tried to stay calm. "According to our plans, this is within HOA-designated property." I asked for the documents. She said it was a common space addition for resident benefit. It was like talking to a broken robot. I left without arguing. No yelling, no cursing, but my brain was spinning. I called my lawyer the moment I got home. He told me to meet him the next morning. I gathered everything I had, survey maps, old deeds, emails from years ago. He looked over it all and frowned. "This isn't just a mistake," he said. "This is a major violation." He told me something that stuck. If they're confident enough to build a hotel without telling you, they think you're too weak to fight. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was focused. And when I focus, I get quiet. I knew if they kept building, the damage would be harder to reverse. So I called the county records office, spoke to zoning and land use authorities. Guess what? No permits, no applications, no environmental surveys, no public meetings, nothing. It was like the entire thing was happening in the dark. I started to see the full picture. The HOA had overstepped, way overstepped. They weren't just encroaching, they were claiming. Try to grab what wasn't theirs while hoping I was too far away or too clueless to notice. And honestly, if I had come home a week later, I might have missed it. But I didn't. I came back just in time. And the timing? Well, let's just say they had no idea what was coming next. Because while they were laying bricks and drawing up floor plans, I was laying something else. A trap. A legal one. Carefully worded. Documented. Verified. A trap that would snap shut the moment they took one wrong step further. And believe me, they were already ankle deep. I didn't waste any time after that first visit to the site. I knew that every nail they hammered, every wall they raised, was going to make it harder to stop them. So I started documenting. Photos, videos, timestamps. I even flew my drone over property just to get a full picture of construction and how deep they'd gotten into my land. What I saw from the sky made my stomach turn. The entire left side of the foundation, concrete already poured, sat about 30 feet inside my boundary line. My crop rows, the soil I had worked for years, were now buried beneath their parking lot. The next day, I met with my lawyer again. He was an old friend of my father's, a calm, Serious man who didn't waste words. He laid out the situation plain and clear. They've trespassed. They've started illegal construction. And if we're smart, we don't stop them yet. At first, I didn't understand. Why let them keep building? He leaned back in his chair and said, because the more money they pour into that project, the harder they'll fall. Right now, they think they're in control. Let them finish just enough to hang themselves with it. That's when the traps started to form. We checked the deed. There was no confusion about the boundary. The survey markers from years ago were still valid. We even went out and remarked the property line with GPS coordinates. Just to be sure, there was no question. They were on my land, and they had no legal grounds for it. But here's the twist. They'd filed papers months ago claiming a communal extension to their neighborhood, and they tried to include part of my land in that extension. The county denied it, flat out, but they went ahead anyway, probably thinking nobody would catch it, or that they'd just pay fines later and get away with it. They didn't know who they were dealing with. I wasn't just some absent farmer. I'd studied property law enough to know what rights I had, and I wasn't going to let an overconfident HOA steamroll my family's legacy. So while they kept building, I kept stacking proof. I filed a formal complaint with the county's land use office. I mailed copies to the planning commission, the zoning department, and the state's attorney's office. Everything dated, stamped, and certified. I also called a private surveyor, independent, not tied to county. He came out with his team, mapped the entire boundary, and issued a professional report showing the exact intrusion. We had everything we needed, on paper, on camera, and on the record. Then something unexpected happened. The HOA president showed up at my house. She arrived in a shiny SUV, stepped out like she owned the place, and tried to smile like we were old friends. She introduced herself, handed me a thick envelope, and said, "We're offering you a generous settlement for the land. It'll benefit the community, and of course, you'll be well compensated." I didn't even open the envelope. I just asked her, "Why didn't you ask me before you built a hotel?" She gave me that blank, plastic smile again. "We thought you'd be open to it once you saw the plans." That was her defense. That I'd be open to it. Like it was some kind of surprise party. I told her to leave and said I'd let my lawyer handle any further communication. She didn't argue. She just turned and left. But I knew what that visit really meant. They were getting nervous. The next week, things got even more interesting. I started getting calls from real estate agents asking about selling parcels. I got letters from companies I'd never heard of offering development partnerships. The HOA was clearly trying to cover their tracks. Fast. And all the while, I said nothing publicly. I didn't make noise. I didn't go to the news or blast them on social media. I let them sweat. Because every day they continued building, they gave me more leverage. They thought they were pressuring me. What they didn't realize was they were building my case brick by brick. A week later, they broke ground on the swimming pool. That's when I knew they were too far gone to pull back. The HOA had doubled down, pouring more concrete, setting up plumbing lines, and laying out fancy brickwork like they were building some desert resort. They were so confident, so sure no one would stop them, that they didn't even notice me watching from the edge of the field. I stood just outside the property line with my arms crossed, watching workers dig a trench right through where my soybean patch used to be. One of them waved at me. I didn't wave back. My lawyer told me, "Now's the time." We sent out the cease and desist, not to the HOA board, but directly to the construction company. A registered, formal letter with a full map of the surveyed boundaries, a legal summary of their trespass, and a demand to stop immediately. The construction boss, some guy named Martin, called me within the hour. His voice was shaking. He said, "Sir, we had no idea this was an HOA land." I believed him. They'd been lied to just like everyone else. He stopped the work that same afternoon. Machines idled down. Hammers fell silent. You could almost feel the tension hanging in the air, like the whole site had gone into lockdown. But not the HOA. No, they weren't done playing games. The very next day, I got a letter on fancy stationery, sealed and stiff. It was a legal threat. The HOA accused me of disrupting community development, of causing financial loss, and, get this, sabotaging property improvements. They were actually threatening to sue me for damages. That's how far they were willing to go. I didn't panic. I didn't even get angry, because what they didn't know was that I had already gone one step further. I had filed a quiet title action. If you've never heard of it, a quiet title lawsuit is how you settle property ownership when someone else is making a false claim. It's not dramatic. It's not fast, but it's deadly effective. I had proof, old surveys, denial letters from the county, and expert testimony lined up. Everything was clean. My lawyer said, they won't win this. Not even close. But while the legal wheels turned, something else happened. Residents from the HOA community started reaching out to me, one by one, quietly, cautiously. Some came by in person, others emailed. They weren't siding with the HOA. They were furious at them. Turns out, most of the homeowners had no clue a hotel was even being built. They weren't asked. There was no vote, no announcement, just a few HOA board members pushing it through, claiming it would raise property values and attract the right kind of clientele. It was all smoke and mirrors. One man, an older veteran who lived on the edge of the subdivision, told me they paved over the dog park and never even told us why. We thought it was just another landscaping project. I kept every conversation, every message. I wasn't building a case against just the board anymore. I was building one that proved this whole operation was shady from the start, and the pressure was growing. The construction halt caused investors to back out. The pool installation crew left and didn't come back. Lumber deliveries were canceled. The HOA president stopped returning calls. Everything started to crumble piece by piece. But the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger. All I did was hold my ground. One afternoon, a young couple came to my house. They were both teachers, living in the neighborhood, and they looked tired. The woman said, "We just want you to know, we support what you're doing. This isn't right." They lied to us, too. I thanked them, then handed them a copy of the public land survey, so they could see for themselves. They shook their heads in disbelief. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about land anymore. It wasn't about concrete or contracts. It was about people being deceived. It was about power being abused. And no matter how high the walls went or how deep they dug, they couldn't build their way out of this. Not this time. A few days later, I got a call from the county commissioner's office. At first, I thought it was just another follow-up on the complaint I'd filed. But the tone in the woman's voice was different this time. Tense, clipped, almost embarrassed. She said, "Sir, we received a request from the HOA to expedite a zoning adjustment hearing regarding your property. They're claiming a clerical error in the original boundary records." I nearly laughed out loud. After everything, now they were blaming it on a paperwork glitch? I kept calm and told her I had all the legal documents to prove the boundaries hadn't changed in over 30 years. She paused for a second, then said quietly, "Good. We'll need them." Apparently, the HOA wasn't just in damage control. They were trying to rewrite history. I hung up and went straight to my file cabinet. Every single piece of paper, surveys, title deeds, denial letters, was perfectly organized. I made copies and sent them out before the hearing date was even announced. I wasn't about to be caught off guard. While all this was happening, word started spreading through the HOA neighborhood. People were whispering in driveways, holding late-night porch talks. The mood had shifted. What started as quiet unease had turned into full-blown mistrust. The homeowners weren't just angry anymore, they were scared. And then came the town hall meeting. It was supposed to be routine, but the turnout that night was the biggest I'd ever seen. The gymnasium was packed. Folding chairs, people standing along the walls, some even sitting on the floor. And there I was, just a rancher in jeans and boots, walking into a room full of people who, just weeks ago, had no idea who I even was. The HOA board sat at the front, looking stiff and uncomfortable. They had clearly hoped no one would show. But when my name was called, the room went silent. I stepped up to the mic and said 6 words. "The hotel is on my land." Gasps, whispers. A few people even laughed in disbelief. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw accusations. I just laid out the facts. I held up the survey results, showed copies of the denial from the county, and passed around a color-coded map that clearly outlined the real boundary. I explained how I'd been out of town for a few months, how they took advantage of that, and how I wasn't even approached until after the concrete had dried. One guy in the crowd, red in the face, stood up and pointed at the HOA president. "You told us the land was donated, that this was all approved." The president didn't answer. She just sat there, flipping papers, refusing to make eye contact. Another woman shouted, "My HOA dues went to this?" It was chaos after that. People yelling, neighbors turning on the board, demands to see financial records. I quietly stepped away, knowing I'd said enough. They didn't need me to stir the pot. The truth had done all the stirring it needed. Back home, I checked my inbox and found messages flooding in, support from residents, apologies, even requests for help organizing a recall of the board. I wasn't interested in their politics, but I appreciated the messages. Then something happened that changed the entire dynamic. A news van showed up at my front gate. I hadn't reached out to the press. Someone else had. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe a construction worker. Didn't matter. The story had leaked, and now they wanted an interview. I declined politely, told them I was letting the legal process play out. But that didn't stop the story from spreading. By that evening, 3 different news stations were covering the saga. One headline read, asterisk, rancher returns to find HOA hotel on his land. Asterisk, another said, asterisk, community turns on HOA over secret construction deal. Asterisk, the more they talked, the deeper the hole the HOA dug itself into. They tried issuing a statement, calling it a misunderstanding. But no one was buying that anymore. Meanwhile, back on my ranch, things were quiet again. The machines were gone. The workers had packed up, and the unfinished hotel sat there like a giant monument to greed and arrogance. It cast a long shadow, not just over my field, but over the people who thought they could take without asking, over those who believed power could overwrite truth. A few weeks after the town hall, everything started to unravel for the HOA board. It didn't happen all at once. No dramatic collapse, but more like slow, painful peeling one lie at a time. The HOA president, who once strutted around like she owned the whole subdivision, stopped showing up to meetings. Her name was suddenly missing from internal communications. Then came the leaks. Documents started circulating, not just zoning paperwork, but emails, real ones, between her, the construction company, and even a couple of shady investors who weren't even from our county. One email had her bragging that the rancher's probably retired or dead, and that the land's practically just dirt. No one's going to miss it. That line hit hard, not because it was insulting, but because it proved what I'd known all along. They thought I was invisible, that I didn't matter, that my land, my history, my family's roots were all just a blank space they could build on. When that email leaked, it spread like wildfire. A neighbor printed it out and taped it to the clubhouse door. Someone else posted it on the community Facebook page. Comments exploded. People weren't just mad anymore. They were furious. And then, just like that, the HOA turned on itself. The treasurer resigned, publicly, said he'd had enough, and that he didn't want to be part of any more lies. He even apologized to me in front of everyone at the next community meeting. Said he was misled too. Said they rushed votes and faked approvals. By this point, the legal side of things had started moving fast. My quiet title lawsuit was headed to court. Their countersuit, yes, they had tried to sue me for interfering with development, was thrown out by a judge before it even reached trial. The judge actually called it frivolous. And while the HOA tried to scrape together a new story, the unfinished hotel just sat there like a scar on the landscape. Weeds were growing around the foundation. Vandals had already spray-painted part of the exterior. It looked abandoned. And in a way, it was... The construction company officially pulled out. They cited legal uncertainties and community backlash. What they really meant was they'd seen the writing on the wall. They weren't going to pour another cent into something that was clearly doomed. Still, the HOA tried to save face. One board member, one of the few still standing, went on local radio to defend their decisions, claimed that the hotel would have brought jobs and opportunity. But no one was buying it. Not after everything. Not after the lies, the forged documents, the sneaky votes. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to scream, "I told you so." I let the facts speak. I let the law do its job. And I let the community realize, on their own, that the people they trusted had gambled away their reputation for a quick payday. One afternoon, I got a call from the county clerk. She said, "Mr. Harlan, we finalized a court ruling. The title is now officially and publicly cleared in your name. There's no longer any legal claim by the HOA." I thanked her and hung up. No smile, no fist pump, just quiet relief. But what happened next was the real surprise. A group of residents, maybe 10 or 12, showed up at my gate the following weekend. They weren't angry. They weren't defensive. They brought coffee and folding chairs. Said they wanted to talk. Just talk. They admitted they'd trusted the wrong people. That they didn't question decisions like they should have. One woman, maybe in her 60s, said, "They told us you'd abandon the land, that you weren't coming back. We had no idea it was all lies." We sat under the tree line that afternoon, just talking, for hours. They asked about the land, my family, what I'd grown there over the years. They listened, and I could see in their eyes they weren't just curious. They were trying to make things right. The irony, after all the shouting, scheming, and court filings, it was that moment that hit the hardest, because it wasn't the HOA that rebuilt the bridge. It was the neighbors, the people who lived next door all along. A few days after that quiet sit-down under the trees, I started noticing small changes around the neighborhood. Subtle but clear. People were waving again. Folks I'd never spoken to before were stopping by my gate just to say hello. Someone even dropped off a homemade pie with a handwritten note that read, "Asterisk, for your patience and for standing your ground." Asterisk. It was strange, this shift in energy. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady, genuine. But the HOA board, they were crumbling. The last few members tried to salvage what they could. They issued a newsletter that was clearly damage control, full of vague promises about transparency, new leadership, and community rebuilding. Nobody cared anymore. No one trusted them. And at the bottom of that very same newsletter, a footnote, just one line, printed small. Due to legal conflicts, all hotel development is indefinitely suspended. That wasn't just a statement. That was an admission. The land was mine. The fight was over. But the fallout had just begun. Then came the audits. A group of residents petitioned the county to open the HOA's books. Turns out a lot more money had gone into that hotel project than anyone realized. Dues had been diverted. Maintenance fees were reallocated. Contractors were paid off the record. When it hit the news, the headline was brutal. Asterisk, HOA funds missing after illegal hotel construction on ranchers' land. Asterisk, even the state attorney general's office got involved. Investigations were launched. Subpoenas were issued. The HOA president, who had gone silent for weeks, finally resigned in disgrace. Through a lawyer. The next time I drove past the clubhouse, it was boarded up. Faded banners flapped in the wind. The front sign had been spray-painted with the word "liars" in red. It was the end of something. Something toxic that had festered for too long. And yet, in the middle of all that mess, something good was happening. Neighbors who barely knew each other were suddenly coming together, organizing their own meetings without the HOA, talking about starting fresh, not with new rules, but with mutual respect. One evening, a father and his two sons from 3 houses down stopped by to ask if they could help clean up the edge of my property. Said the overgrowth and the halted construction had left a bit of a mess. I said sure, thinking they'd just clear a few weeds. They brought rakes, trash bags, gloves. They stayed out there for 4 hours and didn't ask for anything. That weekend, about 20 people from the community came out to help clean up the abandoned hotel site, not to support the HOA, not for money, just because they were tired of looking at it. Someone even brought a grill. There was laughter, kids running around, music from someone's truck. It didn't feel like a protest. It felt like healing. Meanwhile, I was still working with my lawyer, not because I was planning more court time, but because we had to decide what to do with that half-finished hotel structure. Technically, it was mine now, but I didn't want it, and it wasn't safe to leave it standing. My lawyer said, "You've got every right to demolish it or turn it into something else. Your choice." So I stood there the next morning, staring at the steel and concrete skeleton. The sun was rising behind it, long shadows across my field. I didn't see opportunity. I saw a reminder of what happens when people take shortcuts, when they ignore the law, when they build on ground that doesn't belong to them, without ever asking who walked there first. Later that day, I made the call to a demolition crew. They asked, "You sure you want it gone?" I said, "Yeah, I want my field back." And that was it. No headlines, no drama, just the sound of machines rolling in, steel being torn down, dust rising, and beneath it all, the land that had always been mine. The same land my grandfather once plowed, the same soil that had grown our crops, the same space that they tried to steal, now being returned, one brick at a time. After the demolition crews left, the land looked bare, almost like a wound that had finally been cleaned out. No more concrete skeleton, no towering frames, just a big open field again, scattered with fresh dirt and the scent of diesel still hanging in the air. And even though it looked different from before, it felt right. It felt honest. I spent a lot of time just walking that field over the next few days, boots sinking slightly in the soft soil, listening to the birds return, the wind moving gently through the grass that was already sprouting along the edges. A few deer had even started wandering back in, like nature was reclaiming what had been interrupted. Then something unexpected happened. I got a letter, not an official one, not a threat, just a simple envelope, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a short note. "Thank you for standing up when the rest of us didn't know how. You reminded us what community is supposed to mean." There was no signature, just that, but I held on to it. That letter wasn't alone for long. Over the next week, more started coming in. A retired teacher down the road said she'd lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years and never felt like her voice mattered until now. A younger couple thanked me for not letting the HOA turn our area into another overpriced resort strip. One man just wrote, "Asterisk, you were right. We were asleep. Not anymore." Asterisk, I didn't expect any of it. But it made me realize that this whole mess had done something strange. It had forced people to wake up. For too long, they'd been paying dues and nodding along, never really asking where their money went, or who was making the decisions behind the scenes. Now, people were asking real questions, taking charge, forming community groups that didn't need official titles or rubber stamp meetings. They were doing it on their own, voluntarily, respectfully, without the politics. Meanwhile, back on my ranch, I got to work restoring what had been damaged. The fencing needed patching. The irrigation lines, some of which had been ripped up during the pipeline dig, had to be redone. And the barn, which had become a storage site for construction tools I never authorized, needed a serious clean-out. But I wasn't doing it alone. One neighbor brought his teenage son to help. Another donated wood for repairs. A few even brought livestock feed when they heard my deliveries had been delayed during the legal battle. Little by little, the land was coming back to life. Not just physically, but spiritually. The silence that used to feel like isolation now felt like peace again, like how it used to be. One morning, while rebuilding part of the fence line, I looked up and saw a little girl from the neighborhood standing with her mom near the edge of my property. She waved. I waved back. Then she asked, "Is this your farm?" I nodded. "It is." She smiled. "It's pretty." That simple moment hit harder than any courtroom victory, because for the first time in a long while, it felt like this place, this fight, meant something more than just legal wins or land rights. It meant belonging. I didn't need to hold on to anger anymore, not even toward the HOA board. They were gone now, disgraced, dissolved, and forgotten faster than they ever thought possible. Some were still dealing with lawsuits of their own. Others had moved away entirely, trying to escape the mess they created. But I didn't chase them. I didn't gloat. The land was enough. People started asking if I'd ever consider turning part of the ranch into something open, like a local garden or a small community space. I hadn't thought about it before, but the idea stuck with me. Not because I wanted attention, but because maybe, just maybe, something good could still grow out of all this. Not just crops. Trust. Respect. A neighborhood where people look out for each other. Not because they're told to, but because they want to. It wasn't what I planned when I came back. But sometimes, the best things grow in the places where you least expect them, especially when you've cleared out all the weeds. I didn't think much of it at first when an old friend from town stopped by with a drone. He asked if he could fly it over the ranch to take a few pictures of the land now that the hotel was gone. I figured, why not? The skies were clear, and I was curious myself to see how everything looked from above. He launched it from the back of his pickup, and we watched the screen as it climbed over the tree line and swept across the property. From up there, the scars were still visible. The flat, torn area where a construction site used to be, the patches of bare soil, the broken outlines where foundations had been laid. But even through all that, something new had started forming. Green was coming back. Patches of wild grass were reclaiming space. Birds were building nests in the fence posts. It was like the land was forgiving us, piece by piece. My friend emailed me the pictures the next day, and I stared at them longer than I expected. One photo in particular caught my eye. It was of the old oak tree near the center of the field, the one my grandfather used to sit under. In the middle of all the damage, it stood tall, unbothered, unbroken. That image made me realize something. The fight with the HOA hadn't just been about what they did. It had been about what they tried to erase. History, heritage, a legacy. This wasn't just a field to me. It was where my dad taught me how to mend a fence, where we buried our first family dog, where my mom used to hang laundry when the sun was just right. Every inch of that land held stories, and they tried to build over them with cheap drywall and invested dreams. But the roots were still there, and they were deeper than anyone realized. A few days later, I started writing things down, not legal papers or angry letters, but memories, stories of how the land used to be, what it meant to grow up there, the floods, the droughts, the harvests, the laughter. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but it felt important to get it all down. Word started spreading that I was putting together a little booklet. Neighbors I barely knew began stopping by to share their own stories. One man remembered working that land as a teenager baling hay. Another lady had a picture from decades ago, taken during a local parade that passed right in front of our barn. I hadn't planned any of that, but it kept growing, this quiet flood of memory. And slowly, the idea came to turn the land into something more. Not a farm, not just a ranch, but a living story. I started mapping out where to build a walking path, not paved, just gravel and dirt. Something simple, something that would let people walk through and feel connected again, not as tourists, not as guests, but as neighbors. Some folks donated benches. Others brought plants. I even had a group of high schoolers help put up signs made from reclaimed wood, each with a quote from someone in the area about what this land meant to them. One read, asterisk, the soil remembers what the people forget. Asterisk, kids began coming out with their parents just to walk the trail. One little boy asked if he could help plant flowers near the edge. I gave him a trowel, and he worked beside me like it was the most important job in the world. And I guess in that moment, it was because what started as a legal nightmare had somehow become a community heartbeat. We weren't just reclaiming the land. We were rebuilding something we didn't even know we'd lost. Trust, pride, roots. And it all happened not because of a plan or a blueprint or a committee vote. It happened because one person said no, and then decided to say yes to something better. Now, when I stand on my porch in the evening, I see more than fences and dirt. I see life again. Not just mine, but everyone's. The whole town, finally breathing in rhythm.